Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Journey Towards Healthy Living's second official podcast. My name is Tess,
My name is Fiorel.
and today we are joined by our lovely guest speaker, Dr. Karen Trollope-Kumar, founder of Body Brave, which is an eating disorder clinic and treatment center located in Hamilton, Ontario. Karen, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome, Tess.
Thank you so much.
So I guess we'll start and dive right into our questions. So we were just wondering, how did you think to basically to fund this, to be the founder of Body Brave? How did that come about?
Well, my daughter, Sonia, had had quite a severe eating disorder when she was in her late teens. It lasted for about 8 years altogether, and she got very ill. It was a really scary experience for our whole family. And of course, it was horrible for her because she really was extremely ill, in and out of hospital. So after she recovered, which she did, fortunately, we decided to start a community organization to support people in their recovery, because there's not a lot of support for people at an early stage of their eating problems, or for someone who may be coming out of hospital-based treatment and needs some support so that they don't relapse. So we founded Body Brave in 2017, and yeah, it's grown really rapidly ever since.
That is very incredible. And can I just ask, a lot of people I notice when I talk to them, they have had some mixed experiences with inpatient treatment at the hospital. Some people found it very isolating at first because they felt that although they were receiving life-saving treatment, they weren't really dealing with the emotional aspect of eating disorders. And I'm just wondering how your treatment center would differ from an in-person, like an inpatient facility.
Well, by the time people get to requiring inpatient treatment, they're usually very, very sick. And so they need everything that a hospital can offer, the close monitoring of the blood and so on, and as well as supplementary feeding. But at Body Brave, we have people who are not as seriously ill. They're usually at an earlier stage of their illness, which is great because if you are able to do something early in the course of an eating disorder, people have a really good chance of recovering fully and within a fairly short period of time. So that's one of the differences. And then I think we really focus on people's strengths, inner strengths, and on a community. So all of us helping each other, kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's really incredible.
And now that we were speaking, like you mentioned the early symptoms or the early diagnosis, what are the common early signs for eating disorders, generally speaking?
Well, often an eating disorder might start with a person deciding to diet. So they may just decide that they are too heavy, or they may decide that they want to, eat in a so-called healthier fashion, but then it can sometimes just get out of hand, and the restriction of food starts to get more and more. And dieting is often the first step towards developing an eating disorder. Then there are other factors as well. People with eating disorders often tend to be quite sensitive people, often very intelligent, perfectionistic, high achievers. Those are some of the characteristics of some people, not to be stereotypical, but they do tend to be characteristics of many of the people we see at Body Brave. And then once things start, the longer the treatment is postponed, the worse things can become.
What would you say, in your opinion, is a fine line between dieting to be healthy and actually entering that realm of disordered eating?
Well, I think it is a really fine line. And, so many people do decide to change their eating habits for various reasons. For some people, they want to go vegan for ethical reasons, or they decide that they may be having some stomach symptoms and feel like maybe they should go gluten-free or dairy-free. So it starts off kind of innocently, but then sometimes the restriction just gets more and more severe. And there comes a point when the individual suddenly realizes that instead of them being in control of their eating, the eating disorder has gotten control of them. And it's a really scary thing when an eating disorder gets severe.
Yeah, and I was wondering when it comes to starting a diet, a lot of people would like to start a diet, whether you say like it's a belief or like for ethical reasons, or it's like there's something out there like in the internet, there's a trend or like there's like a certain recipe to follow. But as you know, like everyone's different, so everyone should have like a personalized diet. So is there anything you recommend for people that want to start dieting, but like should get it a bit more personalized to avoid getting out of hand, like you have said?
Yeah, like wanting to start dieting in a healthy way, but to also ensure that it doesn't get out of hand.
Yeah.
Is there like, could you possibly give advice for something like that?
Well, I really would caution people about dieting because it can be just so dangerous. But what we encourage people at Body Brave is trying to make sure that they maintain having 3 meals a day and balanced meals each time they eat, as well as a couple of snacks in between meals, because the body functions optimally when it's getting fed every 3 to 4 hours. So, especially for university students, they want to be functioning at their max in terms of their physical well-being, their mental well-being, and the body and mind function best when you're getting regular food intake. So I would just encourage people to make sure that they're eating in a regular way, not skipping meals, and having a variety of different foods.
Okay, so just a follow-up question, because I found myself in first year, I'd like in between classes, I would like to have no gaps. So I didn't have much time to eat. So I'll just drink coffee, which is like horrendous idea. So is there anything you recommend when there's like little time, but you really want to get it in like your nutrients or whatever?
Yeah, so just having in your backpack some good quality snacks, like you could have granola bars, you could have some fruit, maybe some trail mix, some juice boxes, so that even when you've only got a very short period of time, you can just reach into your backpack and grab something that could be really healthy for you and keep your metabolism going at the optimal way. And people find that their concentration is better, their memory is better, if they're fueling their body in a good way.
Those are some very good suggestions. I was a victim to energy drinks and coffee. So, especially back in first year, I just remember that being such an integral part of my diet. And I knew that it wasn't right. It wasn't properly fueling my body, but it's the reality of a lot of the life of a very busy first year. Sometimes we just forget to treat ourselves properly. In your clinic, what would you say is like the most popular age group of people that enter?
Well, we do have our clinic is only for adults, so 17 plus. And so most of our clients, I would say, are between the 17 to 35 age range. That being said, we do get people of all ages, including women over 50 as well. We get some men, not a whole lot, and men do suffer from eating disorders, although they sometimes look different from the type of eating disorder that women typically get. So for a lot of men, there's social pressure to be really muscular and lean. And so sometimes we see men coming into Body Brave who are on very unusual kinds of diets and also spending a huge amount of time working out in the gym. And that's something that's really important to notice, that exercise is such a great thing in so many ways, but it can sometimes get all wrapped up with eating disorder symptoms. And so, if you have a friend who you realize is exercising for hours every day, that could be a symptom of a serious eating disorder. Anything that kind of undoes the calories. So if you've taken in a certain amount of calories and you think, okay, I've got to go to the gym and work this off, that's a worrisome kind of thought pattern.
And people don't often realize that, but
Mhm.
it's exercising intensely is, I would call it technically a form of purging, right? Although it doesn't seem that way, that's their intention, right? It's to exert that food that they taken in previously.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, what would you say is or are the most common types of eating disorders that you would see in your clinic? I mean, I know you get a wide age range, and both like men and women enter your eating disorder clinic. But do you see a trend with like a certain age group matching up to a certain type of eating disorder, or is it just all over the place?
Well, probably the most common eating disorder we see is binge eating disorder. And binge eating disorder is often as a result of people experiencing stress in their life. And when they binge, which means eating a large amount of food in a short period of time, that numbs their emotions and makes them feel a bit better. But of course, it has negative effects on their body. So that's a common one. We do see people with anorexia and bulimia, and also people with mixed forms of eating disorders. So somebody, for example, who might be over exercising, sometimes binging, and sometimes restricting for a couple of days, just a whole mix of different things. And so, yeah, we see a whole range.
Um, I've never heard of binge eating disorder before. You mentioned that it has to do with um, taking in large quantities of food. I know that's slightly. I mean, I could see that it's comparable to that of bulimia, but I know that with bulimia, it also comes with a form of purging afterwards. But how would you differentiate binge eating disorder and bulimia?
So the binges are somewhat different. With binge eating disorder, people don't engage in a behavior on a regular basis to purge. So they don't tend to purge. But otherwise, there are quite a lot of similarities with all types of eating disorders. They're often a response to stress. So they're often coping mechanisms for stress. Because whenever you alter your diet in a drastic way, it reduces emotion. So for people with anorexia, emotions are blunted because they're malnourished.
Right.
And then for people with bulimia or binge eating disorder, the binging does kind of cause a numbing of emotion. And that can be helpful for people when they're experiencing really, really strong and distressing emotions.
Right. Okay. Okay. That makes a lot more sense. So, just a follow up question. Anorexia is dangerous because you can be so severely malnourished that it can cause your internal organs to malfunction at a very serious state.
Mm-hmm.
With bulimia, it's dangerous because of the acid in your esophagus when you purge. But with binge eating disorder, I'm just wondering, why is that harmful? Like, you would think that with eating disorders are classified as some sort of like it's sort of like a strategy to drop weight or to restrict your eating. But I don't really see the harm in binge eating. So if you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, people with binge eating disorder often end up in very large bodies. And so when you are living in a large body, you can experience health complications as a result, like type 2 diabetes or osteoarthritis. So it's different types of health complications that you can get with binge eating disorder. And with bulimia, although you certainly can get acid into the esophagus, which can cause problems, but the most dangerous problem with bulimia is you can get low potassium levels, and that can cause heart irregularities and even heart attacks. So that's where bulimia is very dangerous. And anorexia, as you mentioned, it's more failure of the organs once you get to a very, very low weight.
Also failure of the heart, right? It's
Yeah.
very common for them to get bradycardia
Mm-hmm.
as a result of that, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Mm. But one thing really important for anyone struggling with an eating disorder, and this is something we tell people, having an eating disorder is not your fault. It's not as if people choose to have an eating disorder. As I said, it often starts off with people just wanting to drop some weight or wanting to eat healthier. But developing the eating disorder is not anyone's fault. It's not a lifestyle choice. It's not about vanity. These are really serious brain-based illnesses that have physical as well as psychological components.
Thank you for mentioning that. I think that's a very important message for our listeners, a lot of them being first, second, third year university students, especially during this time. I think it's really, really important that they hear that. So thank you for bringing that up. And yeah, I mean, you're right. Like it's not anybody's fault. I feel like eating disorders are becoming a lot more popular as a result of diet culture. I know that that's something that you're familiar with. Would you be able to explain to our listeners what diet culture is?
Well, basically, diet culture are a set of societal beliefs that equate being thin with being healthy, being thin with being more successful, being more popular, and this whole concept that you can change your body by changing your diet. And of course, diet culture is embedded in our society, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry as well. If you think about it, all the ads that you see, there's so many of those images that are just emblematic of diet culture, encouraging people to go on the latest diet in order to achieve a certain body type. And of course, if diets really worked, then the diet industry would go bankrupt. But in fact, most diets don't work. By far the majority of diets, when people go on them, they end up regaining the weight afterwards anyway. And so diets don't work. And yet, because of this multi-billion-dollar industry, there's constantly ads for the latest diet, the latest fad diet. And people get sucked into it.
So it's really just preying on the most vulnerable population, which is the youth, right?
Yeah.
Because they just seem not to know any better. They're listening to the advertisements.
It's really hard, to realize it, because everywhere we look, there's diet culture is just so much a part of our society. We sometimes don't even realize how prevalent it is.
Now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like I've become jaded to the ads that I see on TV and the billboards that I see. But really, it is everywhere. You're like you said, you don't realize it. How about you, Theo? Do you notice any of those things?
Yeah, I noticed, and that kind of brought a question to my mind. How you said it was a multi-billion-dollar industry, that kind of shines light of the scale that it is. Like, so it can be like not only in Canada, not only North America, but everywhere in the world. And everywhere in the world, that image of like the ideal body type changes per culture. So this is where like my question comes in. Is it like culturally dependent, or do you see a global trend, or is it like, do you know how it like shifts its shape per like culture?
That's a really good question, Theo. And definitely eating disorders can be found in just about every culture of the world. They do sometimes appear in somewhat different forms, and they do seem to be on the rise worldwide, especially with increasing westernization. Eating disorders of various types are increasing in prevalence. And what's been really disturbing in the past year and a half is how much more prevalent eating disorders have been since the pandemic. We've seen a dramatic rise in the number of people reaching out to us, and so have the hospital programs. They've just been having so many people reaching out. And I think it's partly because of the effects of the pandemic. People's routines have been disrupted. There's so much stress and uncertainty. And it's really been very, very difficult for people to go through that kind of stress. And sometimes controlling one's food becomes a way of feeling a little bit more in control of a very difficult situation.
I feel that also eating disorders are very much embedded in routine.
Mm-hmm.
And the way the pandemic laid out, it makes it so much easier to keep that routine
Mm-hmm.
and keep yourself sheltered from other people, which just makes it harder to get help.
Yeah, good point. That's absolutely right.
Yeah, we've seen that since March 2020, you fully transitioned online within 48 hours and got over 600 patients. So is this, like you mentioned, the binge eating disorder, is that the main like eating disorder that increased within the pandemic, or is there
No,
other types?
every type of eating disorder, I would say, has increased. And there's really been an alarming increase among children and youth. So as I said, we don't treat children, but the Children's Hospital at McMaster has really reported a dramatic increase in the number of kids reaching out. We also do some work with Kids Help Phone. We've done some training for their volunteers. And the reason they reached out to us was the Kids Help Phone volunteers were saying that so many kids are phoning in with the concerns about food weight and body image. So we recently conducted this training program for their volunteers about how to recognize when somebody might be struggling and how to respond to their concerns.
I think that's really, really important. I mean, it's really important to note that it's not just adults or
Mm-hmm.
older youth that struggle with eating disorders. It can happen really at any point in life. I mean, I was reading that some people develop eating disorder as early as like the age of 10.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that the children who are calling into those helplines, it seems like, do they want help, or are they just looking for an outlet? Like, what is the point of those children calling in? What do you think?
Well, there's probably a whole variety of different reasons. I think they realize that something is going wrong, that they are losing control of the way that they're eating, or they may be just feeling really uncomfortable with their body image and wanting to talk about it to someone. So, it's really good because the sooner they reach out and try to get some help, the better.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So Theo asked a really good question about the demographics of eating disorders. And I know that you've done a lot of work in India previously. Mm-hmm. And I know that India is more of a developing country compared to North America, Canada, the US. And I'm wondering what the prevalence of eating disorders is in somewhere like India, where people are being, they're not necessarily everybody has the ability to be nourished, they're not. Yeah.
No, it's really true. And, so in India, it depends quite a bit on your socioeconomic status. And people who don't have a lot of money, they'll spend their money on food because they're needing to survive. I would say that eating disorders are not as common among lower socioeconomic classes in India. But among westernized Indians in the big cities, eating disorders are becoming very common. And you can see a real trend over the last 20, 25 years. When my husband and I first started working in India, you think about Bollywood stars, they were women that were really quite well endowed and quite curvy and so on. That was considered the ideal beauty for a woman. But now the Bollywood stars have become really thin. And so it's sort of fascinating to see over the period of a generation how diet culture has kind of infiltrated a country like India. And, in the past, people would be quite complimentary if you were in a curvy body. They would say, "Oh, you're nice and healthy." But, culturally, that's changing as well.
Has the word healthy become kind of like a bad word in within that community now?
Well, yeah, it used to be a compliment, to say you're healthy if you were in a larger body, but yeah, it's not so common to hear that anymore.
Wow. Yeah, it's very interesting to hear how much people change with the changes of beauty norms and standards. Wow.
It's really true.
I have a quick question. It's just regarding the westernization that you've been talking about. Can you define it a bit better regarding eating disorders? Because I think about it maybe perhaps, expansion of like fast food chains or like whatever. But I don't know if that's what you're meaning or just the introduction of the diet culture.
Yeah, I think probably more introduction of diet culture, Western television and so on. There have been some studies done in Fiji, for example, that Fiji was a country that only introduced television in the late 60s. And prior to the late 60s, there was a very, very low prevalence of eating disorders. Then after television came, the prevalence of eating disorders just shot right up. So I think definitely westernized images from TV and those kind of diet culture type things have had an impact for sure. But eating disorders are complex, though. It's not just about diet culture. There's also a strong genetic predisposition, which a lot of people don't realize. So, for example, if you have a family member who's had an eating disorder, you're more likely to develop one. Or if you have a strong family history of mental illness, whether depression or anxiety, again, you're at more risk. So there's very strong genetic influences that many people don't realize are very common. And then also the kind of temperament you're born with. Some people are born with a rather sensitive temperament, a rather anxious temperament, and they also are a little more prone. So, and then other things like trauma, if you've experienced trauma as a child or adolescent, you're more prone to getting an eating disorder, or during a time of transition. So first year university is actually a very high risk time for people, because when you think of it, when you go to university in that first year, everything changes suddenly. Your eating pattern changes, you may be living away from home for the first time. All these different pressures of your academics. Maybe you're not sure which direction you're heading in. So transition times in people's lives, that's another thing that causes a lot of risk for eating disorders.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. So it's just interesting to know that certain things like genetics, the way you were brought up, it brings up that whole nature versus nurture topic, that debate. That's really interesting. And we are almost out of time, but just quickly, for our listeners, I was wondering if you could let us know if you notice that your friend might be suffering from an eating disorder. What are some common signs that you could look out for, and how could you be there as a support for them?
So I would say if you're noticing that your friend is skipping meals or eating just super low calorie food or not wanting to go out and eat with friends, those might be some signs. Or people over exercising, spending hours at the gym, or just looking really tired, low mood. Those might be some signs that you could tell might be a concern. And then in terms of supporting your friends, just, asking a very open-ended question like, is anything bothering you? Is there anything I can help you with? I'm here for you if you need to talk. You don't want to come right out and say, hey, I think you might have an eating disorder. You just want to be really open and supportive and just say, if there's anything that you need, if there's anything I can help you with, or you just want to talk, I'm here for you. I think that's a good way to start anyway.
Right. So it's good to keep the conversation going, just letting them know that you're there for them. That's really important.
Yeah.
And I think it's just finally, I think it's just really important to know that, especially during the pandemic, there are so many sources that people who are suffering from eating disorders, or friends who are worried about their friends suffering from eating disorders, they can reach out. There are online supports. There's Body Brave. There are websites that give more information about various types of eating disorders. So I think that's also very important to note. Karen, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us. This has been so informative.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Tess and Theo, and you guys are doing a wonderful job. What a great project.
Thank you.
It was lovely having you and meeting you.
Of all the magic places in the world I've been to, this is where my heart is. Oh, you know it's true, no matter where